We have finally arrived in Act 2. After the Act 1 video took an absurd amount of time, this one is gonna be much faster. The characters are all going to be closer to a certain level, so I don't have to talk about as many potential situations. I already covered a lot of the users' abilities in detail and explained why they're useless, and I won't be repeating myself on them. I will mention when an ability changes its purpose, and I'll talk about all the ones that stay relevant. I will talk about all the relevant abilities for Act 2 in this video, but if you want more detail beyond that, I recommend checking out the Act 1 video. I will, however, cover the few new abilities in detail, even if they are useless. I will also not go over agility values again, even if they play a big role. Furthermore, all characters now have access to the 10 bonus skill points, so I will also not mention them here. The surprise panel is the yellow space on the skill tree graphic from Neoseeker that I will be showing for each character. I am also not going to cover the Wheel of Armor here. A few abilities, namely the self buffs that increase durability, can be useful there, but that's very specific and I don't want to mention it for every character. Lastly, there's a few characters that you don't need to get in a certain order. For those, I will list them in the order that I recommend getting them in. And with all of that out of the way, we can finally start with... Before he unlocks more of his skill tree at the very start of Act 2 after Tyrant, Unbridled Blade is still king, with Giga Slash arguably being useful for Everwith and the doppelgangers that Drab summons. Sword Dance takes tons of skill points, and while it outdamages Unbridled Blade by an insignificant amount, it doesn't outdamage Unbridled Blade with a few skill points put into extra strength and attack while using great swords. Even if you're at a high enough level to have Sword Dance, it's never worth it. Getting a low critical rate, meaning a quarter of your displayed critical rate on every hit, isn't worth the significant cost. This results in the Luminary basically only using Unbridled Blade. Later, once you unlock the full skill tree, depending on the situation, you can also go for the Pep Up ability, Kazap, Giga Gash and Omni Heal. Pep Up is the same as in Act 1, but you have even more powerful pep powers available to you. One of those is Yggdrasil's Blessing, and that's the main reason you'd get Omni Heal to begin with. The Luminary only has enough MP for 1 or maybe 2 cards, and you lose out on a lot by getting it, but starting a fight with Yggdrasil's Blessing can be enough to win it by itself if you're really stuck on something. It does get removed by disruptive waves and a few status effects can hit through it, but full damage immunity on your whole party is pretty OP. Kazap and Zapple are rarely talked about, but they're pretty good. At a certain magical might range, Zapple does almost the same damage as Kazap, but costs way less MP. That's the only reason to get it. Kazap does 360 base damage, Giga Gash for example only does 220 and Giga Crash does 250 to start. Meaning Giga Gash is only really better when you're fighting multiple groups and Giga Crash sucks. From a story event you get Quadra Slash and other sword AoE abilities, and they are what you go for when you don't have points in Giga Gash and want AoE. You can always swap to a sword for the splitter abilities and they will work the same as if you invested in swords exclusively. Blade of Ultimate Power is technically stronger than Kazap, but the skill point requirement is too steep for Act 2, so Kazap is still the best damage option the Luminary has if you don't want to set up with attack buffs and zap. It also helps that Lightning is probably the best damage type in this game, since almost every boss in Act 2 is at least slightly weak to it. The last ability I want to mention is Keklang, which is useful in a lot of situations. It sort of breaks the game in some ways. It's possible to, for example, solo the game with the Luminary by spamming Keklang with HP and MP recovery items equipped. It has a lot of niche uses like being a poor man's status cure or allowing a few more sorts of cheese, but I almost never use it despite it being one of the more interesting skills in the game. The overall role of the Luminary doesn't change an awful lot. He still mostly wants to use great swords and hit things hard with Unbridled Blade, but there's at least one more person that does that better. And given how many niche abilities he gains, from time to time he can do something else. Especially if there's a high level gap between him and the rest of the party, and given how peps become more common in Act 2, having him sit safely on the bench until you need a pep power is totally viable. Even at low levels he's still the most important party member, but he's not quite as dominant as he was in Act 1. If there's one thing to say about Hendrik, it's that at an equal level he outdamages the Luminary while using great swords, and he might even be higher level if anything. The Luminary does get more attack from the skill tree once you start maxing it out, but for the purposes of Act 2, Hendrik is the better damage dealer by a bit, and it takes way more to kill him. Going last pretty reliably and being so tanky is already a huge boon. If you only had him spamming the Sage's Stone and perfect Panaceas later on, he'd still be good. While he technically has a lot of abilities, he never needs to bother with all the shitty abilities that other party members already didn't want to bother with after the first few hours of Act 1, so I will not be talking about Flame Slash or Metal Slash in great detail here. A lot of people like using him with axes since nobody else has them, but if they're bad, it's not a shame to not use them. They end up being alright however. Scrap metal can reduce defense and is good utility. Axes of Evil are technically Hendrik's best group damage option, but you never want to use them for AoE damage and you can swap them out at the start of random battles, so I recommend doing that instead of using axes to patch up one of his weaknesses in exchange for his biggest strength. Parallax doesn't have a good chance to paralyze at 25% and most bosses don't care about it either way. I don't recommend using it for damage over greatswords or anyone else if you can help it. The most valid reason to use axes is to have a free hand force shield. Immense defense is not that great in my opinion. It gives you a 50% higher block chance for 2 turns, but Hendrik is too tanky for that to matter, and the duration is not that long. You'd have to apply it again and again, and blocks don't even work against most abilities. Back Etcher has a similar problem. It's a worse flashback that lasts a third as long, but it's useful against bosses that reduce the amount of party members available, like Gildigger when the others get turned into statues, and it doesn't actually require a shield, so you can use it with no armor. I've also never had a use for Holy Impregnable, since it guarantees that you lose an action now. The upside is maybe not losing an action or two someone else would spend using a Panacea later on. It would be best suited for no armor since you don't have ways to reduce the likelihood of status effects affecting you, but you can't activate it in that mode, just like all the other abilities from that tree except for Back Etcher. Hendrik can also use regular swords and he has a high multiplier on Gerfalcon Slash, but it does less damage than great swords in all scenarios without seed grinding for hours. So great swords are definitely the way to go in my opinion. He is going to be the best or second best damage dealer in most fights. Among the abilities he can use with great swords, a Kata buff is worse than Unbridled Blade. Blind Man's Biff is too situational, so outside of the Jasper fight if you really want to flex on him you are not going to use it. So what I recommend is either good or reliable Unbridled Blade or Double-Edged Slash if you want to intentionally kill him to reset a turn before the boss gets to act. Or if you want to use an Yggdrasil Leaf instead of healing him. For that to not lose you in action you need pretty specific circumstances where he doesn't go last, and basically it's too niche, so 99% of the time you're going to be using Unbridled Blade. When he doesn't want to attack yet because the enemy has full defense and his attack wasn't buffed yet, he can also buff his own attack with Double Up. This is the only other ability I recommend on him, so basically the way I use the skill points is only damage increases, Unbridled Blade and Double Up. He also has spells, but with the exception of Kabuff if you're playing with armor, they are all bad and shouldn't be used. Useful pep powers include Blaze of Glory, which is the worst pep to buff your attack with, but that's still good. Executioner, which is pretty good damage against high defense enemies and only requires Hendrik to be pepped up, and once Serena joins you, Knight's Mandate. Knight's Mandate works similarly to Saint's Song, which I already gushed over in the Act 1 video, enabling an ability for stowing. This one is much stronger and not only makes Hendrik invincible, but it attracts all single target attacks to him, so especially against bosses that like to spam single target attacks, for example Tatsunaga, this is a free win. But no matter the boss, it still allows him to have more turns to do what he does best, and that's beating up bosses with an oversized sword. Dirge of Dundersill is the main thing that makes Swap good. Kisnooze by itself is already good, but Dirge of Dundersill guarantees to sleep on everything that isn't semi-immune, so unless it's a 99% resistance, in which case Dirge of Dundrasil still has a 75% chance of hitting. With the exception of the final phase of the final boss, every boss sleeps. Later on with Erik, this is much preferred to poison since bosses sleep for up to 4 actions, so if they haven't woken up after one turn, you can wake them up with the massive damage boost, and it didn't even take an action to set up. But even without, it's a full turn to apply debuffs, buff yourself, start doing damage with things that won't wake the boss, and it only requires Web to be pepped. Whenever Web takes a big hit and gets pepped up automatically, the boss is gonna go lose up to 4 actions. I usually mention pep powers last, but this is the biggest thing Web has going for him. The new abilities he can get from the skill tree all don't do much. The tree doesn't give him any real benefit either way, just irrelevant passive buffs aside from the bonus agility, but that only sometimes matters. Multi-heal is great, and blunt or bounce shut down some of the bosses. Removing buffs via clear your mind or wake and break also has a lot more uses in Act 2. The rest is the same as Act 1 in that it really doesn't matter. Zap is still what it was, and you're gonna be using him for that most of the time. He also learns Pearly Gates, which is an odd ability since it does whoosh damage but increases Zap type damage taken, and while it's better than his damage spells in most cases, it's only something I use when he's fizzled or when I need AoE damage. Act 2 Sylvando doesn't get many new tricks. He has Umfel now and he's the best at using it. If you're not using one of the 3 pep powers that increase everyone's attack, Umfel is as close to mandatory as an ability can get. Hustle Dance is still good, practically just another multi-heal so you can spread out the MP consumption. Gold Rush isn't as broken as it was in Act 1, but the cost becomes a lot lower relatively speaking as well. It still either skips random battles all the way through or at least allows you to finish most fights off with a Pearly Gates or Quarter Slash, and Gold Rush is still his best damage option. Unlike Act 1, Erik is going to do damage with knives, so setting up for him with Cobra Strike is valid. Heather Ball for metal farming is good with metal swords since every hit gets bonus damage, but it's never your first or second option. With nastier knives, the confusion chance on Heather Ball also becomes quite decent while holding a knife. Besides that, the status cure, status effects, agility manipulating moves and arguably Worm Whip are still occasionally useful, but since Act 2 power creeps everything, they're not as impressive. Sobering Slap, for example, is worse than a perfect panacea for everything but beguilement, since the panacea would also heal HP. Everything else is still not worth using. He does get a pep power that only he needs to be pepped up for, but Hendrik has to be present, that poisons all enemies guaranteed. You have to waste a few skill points to get it, and it's not as good as Dirge of Dundrasil, but if you want to set up for Erik, it's reliable. And speak of the devil, when you first get Erik, he has no abilities. With only his spells, which do pretty good damage over the whole duration, especially Mountain Mover at level 42, and with the ability to cure sleep and other status effects with items, while going first, he's really valuable to have, even in this neutered state. Going first means you can cure party members before their actions come up. When he finally unlocks the whole skill tree, Erik is the most interesting character in terms of build choices, even more so than Serena. Now with more skill points to stack effects like Divide or maybe even Dually Deadly, and with higher comparative attack, Erik got one hell of a glow up. The speedrun uses swords and I can definitely see why. Fatal Flash is the weakest of the ultimate moves with only a 2.5 times multiplier, which is less than Unbridled Blade for example, but he gets 90 extra attack from his tree, so the simplest and most efficient way of using him at lower levels is Fatal Flash with Divide. Divide definitely outperforms Dually Deadly and Dual Wield. The second option is going straight for critical claim while still holding a sword, but that's more of a meme since you only have MP for one cast. It does do well when farming metal enemies, and without setup it is technically his best damage option, but needing to restore his MP after every use is a hassle and makes it not worth doing, even if you set it up with Divide. Boomerangs are interesting because they get double down. Their attack is the lowest but they have the highest multiplier, so with Zap and Umfel they get pretty close to the other options. For reference, Victimizer has a 6 times multiplier and Double Down has a 3.6 times multiplier. especially when you get to higher levels and the attack gap starts closing. Setting up with Erik himself and using Victimizer is worse than using Double Down twice. It also makes Zap more likely to stick, which is super useful. But again, swords are the best in the most situations, even if they are bowing. Lastly, daggers have the combo and Erik has enough attack, even plus 30 attack from the newly unlocked segment of the skill tree, that he does meaningful damage. For my testing, he doesn't outdamage Hendrik in most fights if Erik is also the one setting up his own poison, especially not on average if you consider that poison won't always stick. Daggers strongly depend on the battle. If you're using status effects either way, it's the best you're gonna do. If the boss is like more dragon and immune to sleep while being highly resistant to poison, then daggers have a problem. No matter which one you're going for, divide should be the first priority. Then you should get the remaining attack bonuses, and only then should you be thinking about really deadly. Think of it as increasing your multiplier by ×1. So making Double Down go from 3.6 to 4.6 times damage. Divide on the other hand increases your multiplier by 1.5 times, since over 2 actions you get 3 times damage. Though with Zap and Umfil not being applied on the first action of combat, which is Erik since he's going first, it's much better than that. As a side note, most bosses only use disruptive waves on set turns when you have a certain amount of buffs, and you can not divide when you know it's about to come up. Else disruptive waves can really hurt your divide plays, but they are rare. And yeah, Shitebox can also mess with your divide plays. And for pep powers, Erik doesn't get anything notable, but Wildside goes from good to great since Erik got so much of a glow up. Jade has 3 ways of being used and that's it. Multi-feed and a bit of the spear tree, sex appeal, or flashback, which also gets you crushed eyes on the way. Either way, she should be holding a spear, since claws are still as bad as they were in Act 1 and the average damage while using them is worse in all scenarios, as you'll see in the background. The gap isn't as huge as it was in Act 1, but it's still there. While making this video, I read through and watched a lot of other guides, and I've seen so many people praise Hardclaw that I legit wonder what all of them have done to reach that conclusion. Look at the numbers and judge for yourself. Especially after you get the poker, since it ignores parries, but even before then, for example the Storm Spear with its Zap type damage does extra damage to a lot of enemies too. It's hard to even find a boss where spears don't have an unfair advantage, since Alizarin with his crippling lightning weakness or Tatsunaga with his ice weakness are so skewed in favor of spears. And the claws are so annoying to even get, you can't buy or find most of them, you have to grind rare drops or do side quests like the horse racing. But even the best claws don't know damage basic weapons, not even the ones bought in a store. Most of the background footage I'm skewing this way in the favor of claws already, since I've got more points in them. I'm not using multi-feed and I'm not upgrading her weapons, which would widen the attack gap with spears. I also wish there were more cases where claws are viable, except for when you're reliant on a crit, which you get 3 chances at half the displayed crit chance for to do any meaningful damage, and in that case you shouldn't be attacking anyways. Or you should use lightning thrust, lightning storm, something else. But sadly, there is no scenario in which claws function. Here's a final clip of me skewing the situation in favor of spears for reference, and with that horse thoroughly beaten, we can go back to discussing her actual options. Sex appeal is the weakest option here, it's her only AoE, but just don't use her for AoE, you already have so many options forced on you as is. Femme Fatale only has a 10% chance to sleep and the heal is minuscule. But with the damage being basically the same, this makes it just as good, if not better than Pink Typhoon, unless an enemy is specifically weak against wind. Lightning Storm from a spear tree is kinda the same. The main upside to sex appeal is getting the skill tree and therefore the pepper power up, which makes the agility increase when pepped go from plus 100% to plus 150%. If you need her to go first and activate Yggdragon's Blessing or Roaring Tirade at the start of a battle, it might be worth thinking about, but outside of Act 3 bosses at super low levels, which isn't what this video is about, this isn't necessary. Multi-feed is the best damage option against a lot of things with a 3.5 times multiplier. Crushed Ice technically has the highest multiplier at 3.6 times, but right after she joins, a few bosses strongly resist ice, and for those it doesn't do well at all. Miracle Moon heals a meaningless amount of damage and only has a 2.5 times multiplier, so it doesn't matter. On the matter of Crushed Ice again, if you go for Flashback, which I recommend for certain bosses like Tatsunaga, you will get Crushed Ice. At base level you won't even be able to get multi-thrust afterwards though, so if our boss is resistant to ice, then you can't expect to do any meaningful damage with Jade. This does not make her useless though, since items are so strong in Act 2 and you still have Flashback active. In all other cases her damage is pretty similar to if you had taken multi-feed, and utility for Flashback is huge, so I better get to talking about it. Flashback gives you guaranteed dodges and counters to every counterable attack. This basically boils down to single target physical attacks. Sometimes you can predict them, like in the Gildigger fight, there's a guaranteed wake and break after she turns 2 of your guys into statues and buffs her attack that will usually mess you up pretty badly, but with Flashback you turn it into an opportunity for more damage. Another fight this excels at, and I've hinted at it multiple times, is Tatsunaga, where she counters all the normal and desperate attacks. It won't make the enemy more likely to target her, but as long as she's in the first slot in your party the chance is already 40%. And it lasts 3 turns. It ticks down at the start of your turn, so you can apply it, act twice, then reapply it after it runs out, and it won't have had any downtime. For some fights this is borderline useless, for some fights like Tatsunaga it's game breaking. Thanks to how strong Crushed Ice is, I'd go with this build for all of Act 2 except the final fight, maybe Lizuin and the Auroral Serpent. But no matter the build, when you don't want to attack yet for whatever reason, Revamp can act as a worse double up to slightly increase your attack for not totally insignificant MP cost. Besides that and Flashback, she's similar to Act 1 in her role as someone who goes first and attacks, but her damage isn't as impressive now, so making her use items or activate peps is probably her best use now. Of course with the exception of fights where she hits on a significant lightning or ice weakness. If you're playing with Igdragon's Blessing, she especially shines, since she's gonna be the first to act and therefore in a lot of cases the best one to activate the pep power with. Sadly the final party member is already Serena, but she's pretty good now. Serena learns all the spells that her sister would have learned at her level. This means if you take her all the way up to level 70, she will in fact learn Magic Burst. She also gets her sister's magical might stat, so surprisingly her Kaswoosh ends up having the highest damage output in most cases since it really scales fast. Kazis technically does the same damage at max, but it would take 360 instead of 250 magical might. You're probably not reaching that cap either way, so Kaswoosh does more. And yes, if you buff up her attack, her physical attack options would outdamage it, but Serena does not want to attack. She has Blunt, Zap, Umfel and Multi-Heal. If possible, she wants to not use Umfel since the Echo doesn't help with that, but if Sylvando isn't doing it then obviously go for it. These are all incredibly useful abilities, but the abilities from her skill tree are mostly kinda useless, with even Alma Mater for example not being worth her action, since she has so much else she wants to do. Unlocking the Echo is a nice bonus for sure, but besides that nothing on there matters too much. You should prioritize the passive bonuses since they at least do something. Grace of the Goddess is often not better than just healing her or even reviving her after the fact. Wormwhip can be replaced by so many other characters whose actions are worth a bit less, and while Be Like Water is kinda nice to protect her, it's only worth the activation in a few specific fights like against Tatsunaga. The weapon she's holding on to barely matters, just like with the other 2 characters that amalgamated into her. Her best choice is usually a shield, but if you are no armor then Great Wands, Wands and Spears are all pretty much the same, and you can switch around anyways depending on whether you heal or in a rare situation cast an offensive spell. She's the ultimate support now, and being able to do decent damage is a nice bonus. She has the best chance of landing Blunt or Zap, and multi-heal being able to heal twice can save you valuable actions. Turns out the 2 best characters from Act 1, combined and with a bunch of new abilities including sometimes getting a double action, are pretty good. Now that I'm done with this, I thought it would be fun to make a tier list on how much each character contributes throughout each act in the average playthrough and how often them permanently being dead would harm you. Not how much it would harm you, just how often, since else joining early would largely favor certain party members. This still favors joining early, but that's because joining early is good. I don't even like tier lists because it doesn't properly convey when you should use each party member. If someone is bad, it doesn't mean they're actually bad, it means that there are few instances where they shine. But I do think I can more properly show how quote unquote bad I think Erik is in Act 1 when I for example talk about how bad his damage is for 10 minutes and only mention him being fast and bulky, kinda being useful for 2 seconds. Oftentimes the simplest to explain aspects are the most impactful. As a bonus, I'm even throwing in more than my legally required amount of Act 3 discussion, not counting the hair-raising suit since that's basically guard mode. These all probably change based on the time of day you ask me, so don't think too deeply about it.